And it should be no surprise that there's an episode in the Songs of Milarepa that attribute this footprint to Milarepa himself. So the Madman was sort of somewhat obliquely acceding the point that he was in fact a reincarnation of Milarepa. Now, if the Madman demurred for much of his life about his status as Milarepa's re-embodiment on his deathbed, he affirmed it in no uncertain terms. So in his final instructions given to followers just before passing away, he makes the following proclamation. He says, "Monks and disciples, together with my patrons, you have directly met Milarepa himself during the degenerate age, and so you have good karma and excellent fortune. Moreover, continue to look at Milarepa's life and equate your life with his practice." So, summarizing his life during the final moments of his life, the Madman turns to the figure of Milarepa, presenting himself as the Yogin incarnate, returned to the world for the benefit of beings during a period of degeneration and decline. So finally, a life brought to life. So having established the relation posited by the tradition between the Yogin and the Madman, the subject and his author, we can now turn to the text itself and to a closer reading of the narrative frame that it employs. Now, virtually all of Milarepa's early biographies open with a very humble description of the Yogin's early life, of his origins. But the Madman, however, introduces his version with an extensive narrative frame that opens in the following way. It begins, "Thus have I heard. At one time, the powerful Lord of Yogins, the great Heruka himself," greatly, the Heruka here is referring to Milarepa, not to himself, because this is kind of a double entendre. At one time, the powerful Lord of Yogins, the great Heruka himself, renowned as Jotsu Milarepa, was residing in the sacred place called Belly Cave in the region of Yinam, turning the wheel of the great vehicle Dharma, seated in the middle of his heart disciple Yogins, and it goes on to list, many of his disciples, and then the variety of human and non-human, sort of celestial and divine followers who are seated there. So the scene unfolds. The scene unfolding here clearly mirrors the canonical literature of Indian Buddhism. For those of you who have read early Indian Buddhism, this will sound familiar to you. The passage begins with the formula, "Thus have I heard." Here, repeating the words attributed to the Buddha's faithful attendant Ananda, and intending to reflect his perfect recitation from memory the Buddha's teachings at the first monastic council. In the context of the early canonical Buddhist discourses, called sutras, these words were meant to describe the text as an eyewitness record of what the Buddha taught, and thus project upon it an authority reserved for the canonical word of the Buddha, in Sanskrit, Buddha Vachana, or Buddha-voiced text. In the Indian commentarial literature, the words, "Thus have I heard," have been glossed as the scriptural opening, and the remainder of the passage, beginning with "at one time," forms the text's setting that describes where the discourse was given and who was in attendance. Many Buddhist discourses establish the elements of the setting with a statement such as, "At one time, the Buddha was residing in Ultra Peak in Rajgriha with a great assembly of monks and a great assembly of bodhisattvas," and so on and so forth. Now, in the passage here, the Madman adapts this format to suit his own dramatis personae. The place is identified as Belly Cave, and the teacher, Milarepa, is discoursing on the Mahayana doctrine to the marvelous retinue, including his close disciples and a host of human and non-human devotees. And later in the episode, Milarepa's disciple, named Rachungpa, is inspired by a miraculous dream to request Milarepa to recount his own life story. And in this case, here the disciple is cast in the role of another of the Buddha's followers, Shariputra, who frequently serves as the actor who inspires the Buddha to teach. And then Milarepa famously proceeds to tell the story of his life, which constitutes the main body of the text. And here, the text is really paralleling a very famous early Mahayana and early Indian sutra, which tells the life of the Buddha, called the Lalita Vistara. This is a story in which the Buddha himself is asked by one of his disciples to tell the story of his life, and then he preaches as a Dharma discourse all of the events of his early life, leading up to his enlightenment shortly thereafter. Now, Buddhist commentarial literature has further discussed the identification of the I in Thus Have I Heard. So this individual is described as the so-called rapporteur, referring to his various activities from the marker of the Buddha's word, the leader of its public recitation, and the convener of a council to determine its content. That is, it refers to his activities from speaker to reciter to redactor. And in Tibetan, the term that's used literally translates as the gatherer of the Buddha's word. And in this sense, he is the speaker and the reciter and the redactor of the Buddha's authentic speech. In the Buddhist discourses, this individual is frequently, although not always, identified as Ananda, and his identification as rapporteur carried deep implications about how and when and for whom such teachings were given, especially in the context of later Mahayana works, which we know were written many centuries after the Buddha died, and long after anyone could have actually heard the Buddha say anything. So as I noted earlier, many of those who first read the Life of Milarepa outside Tibet understood the speaker of Thus Have I Heard to be the Yogin's close disciple Rinpoche, leading them to attribute the entire biography to him. But I think the rapporteur's voice may be equally understood as belonging to the author, the Madman Tsongyin Haruka, who is universally equated inside Tibet with gathering and preserving not the Buddha's word, but Milarepa's collected words. Now, in the view of traditional Indian commentators, the opening, that Thus Have I Heard, identifies the rapporteur's eyewitness experience of the teaching, while the setting, at one time, functions primarily to authorize him as a reliable person and a valid source. The words "at one time" here have been described as being particularly apt for recalling what is within the personal experience of the speaker, and thus it stands in stark contrast to the kind of fairy tale preamble, once upon a time, that locates action in the distant past. So what then does it mean for the madman, that the madman himself can state, "Thus have I heard," a phrase meant to imply his status as an eyewitness about the words of an individual who lived some 4 centuries earlier? Now, unlike the Indian Buddhist writers who were forced to adopt complex strategies of interpretation and legitimation to defend their works as the word of the Buddha, to explain this phrase, "Thus have I heard," long after the Buddha's demise, the approach adopted by the madman and his biographers was fairly straightforward. He concludes his colophon, that is the final bit of the text of the Life of Milarepa, by stating, quote, "Although I have seen many biographies of Milarepa, I, the one dressed in bone ornaments, the Yogin who wanders in charnel grounds," which is how he referred to himself, "I have put this into writing perfectly and completely, just as it was recounted by an extraordinary master." So, as we've seen, the madman was indeed described as having received at an early age, at the age of 26, the direct transmission of Milarepa's life story through a visionary encounter with the Yogin. And from the perspective of the madman's own biographical tradition, at least, he not only read early accounts of Milarepa's life story, he heard it directly from his guru's own mouth. And yet the madman's direct experience of the Yogin's life was described as extending deeper still. He not only heard the life story in vision, as a visionary experience, but as the Yogin's re-embodied it. That is, he had actually lived it himself. So in this way, Tsongyin Haruka, the madman, may have written his account with himself serving as the I of the stories, "Thus have I heard." And the content of what he heard, designated thus, would refer to the extraordinary biography, as mentioned earlier. A version of the life story, extraordinary not so much in terms of its content, but in the means through which it was authorized, that is, through its delivery by a so-called extraordinary master. And in this case, the tradition could claim that Tsongyin formulated his extraordinary biography